Hi, my name is Megan Flynn, and I will be going through Chapter 1 of our Concepts of Biology Openstax textbook. If you have not had a chance to take a look at the Openstax textbook, you can access it for free under that website, openstax.org/books, and you can look for that Concepts of Biology textbook. So I will be going through Chapter 1 in this video. If you like what you see and would like to continue looking at other videos with subsequent chapters, please hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss any of the new videos that get posted. So in Chapter 1 falls under the category of the cellular foundation of life in the Concepts of Biology Openstax textbook. And within that concept, we're going to be focusing in on Chapter 1 today, the Introduction to Biology. Specifically, this video will cover the first part of Chapter 1, the themes and concepts of biology. The next video that I will be posting will be the process of science, which covers the remainder of Chapter 1. So don't miss out on that. Make sure you click that subscribe button. So as far as Chapter 1, we're going to get into the themes and concepts of biology. So by the end of this video, you should be able to identify and describe the properties of life, describe the levels of organization among living things, as well as list examples of different subdisciplines of biology. So all three of these objectives will be covered in this video. So before we even get started, we need to know what is biology. Well, biology is the study of living organisms and their interactions with one another in their environment. So when we're studying biology, we're studying anything that's alive and how it's interacting with its environment. So it can be, at the broad scale of looking at all the living things on Earth, like we see from this picture, down to the most smallest component of a living organism, such as what's inside the cells. We're going to go ahead and begin talking about, what is life? Okay, so what are the characteristics of life? So we're going to go through the 8 properties of life. Now, depending on which textbook you've reviewed, I've seen the properties of life vary from textbook to textbook. So just be aware of that. In the Concepts of Biology Openstax textbook, they identify 8 properties of life. So we will be going through each one of these properties. So all living things must have order to them. They must have sensitivity or response to stimuli. All living things reproduce. Living things as a whole, populations of living things adapt to their surroundings. They grow and develop. There's some sort of regulation within the living thing in order to maintain homeostasis. Living things process energy, and populations of living things evolve over time. So we're going to go through each one of these individual categories of life or properties of life, starting with order. So let's take a look at this toad, and if I were to look inside this toad, I would see a very highly organized structure. This toad is composed of different organ systems. It has a respiratory system, it has a digestive system, it has all sorts of circulatory system, endocrine system. It's all these different systems, organ systems that seem to work together to allow this toad to survive and live and breathe and do whatever the toad is doing. And so it's a very highly organized structure with these organ systems, and then each of these organ systems have organs that are made of tissue, that are made of cells. So it's a very highly organized structure. And so all living things have that complexity to them. They are very organized in nature. All living things also respond to stimuli. So, for example, take a look at this plant here. So this plant, if I were to touch its leaves, it would kind of droop away from me. So it's responding to that stimulus that I'm providing it. So living things have that ability to respond to things. And, you know, it might be a negative or a positive response to something that they are, some sort of stimulus that is touching them or occurring to them. So another example of a response to a stimuli is introduced in this video. So that you have a link to this video if you take a look at the textbook portion, but I'll go ahead and just show you the video so you can see what it's about. I'm going to go ahead and mute the video because it doesn't really apply to necessarily what we're talking about with the response to the video or response to the stimulus. So hang on one second, let me go ahead and grab that video for us. So here it is. Now this is just a news report that goes into studying how sunflowers follow the sun. But take a look at those leaves right there. Notice how they're moving in response to where the sun is located in the sky. So this is another example of living things responding to stimuli. The leaves of the plant, they need sunlight in order to perform photosynthesis. So throughout the day, you might notice the leaves facing the sun more, okay, so that it can get that sunlight. Also, the actual flower itself kind of tilts towards the sun, and you'll see that it follows the sun throughout the day. And the reason why it's doing this is that it needs pollinators, right? The reason why we have a flower is so that it can transfer pollen from one flower to another so that it can reproduce. And so it's going to be facing the sunlight so that it's heating up the nectar inside, which entices the bees and the other insects to the flower so that it can transfer that pollen. Okay, so that's just an example of that response to the stimuli. So pretty cool. Another property of life is that living things reproduce. So the smallest unit of life is a cell, and even that cell needs to replicate. It needs to divide and go on to make daughter cells. And the reason why it does this is so that it can pass on that genetic information to the daughter cells. So all living things need to reproduce, whether it is a cat that's reproducing, passing its genes on to the next generation in her kittens, or even a cell inside your body needs to divide and pass on the genetics to the daughter cells so that you can continue having all of the information in order for that cell to process and do whatever it's supposed to do. So all living things need to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. So reproduction is a characteristic of life. It's a property of life. Also, another property of life is adaptation. So adaptation is an accumulation of traits that allow individuals to be better suited to the environment that they live in. So for example, look at these kittens. Now cats in general, they have a number of traits that make them very good hunters and very good companions to humans. And those adaptations that they have accumulated over time. So for example, I can see here, look at the fur. So cats, they have this fur that covers their body and that helps keep them warm, as well as provides them camouflage if they're hunting, and so forth. Also, look at the placement of the eyes. The eyes are forward like us. They're not on the periphery like deer or, a lot of other organisms like chameleons or something like that. And so this tells me right away that they are predators. So they're going to need to focus in on their prey. And so that's a useful adaptation for them in order to get food so that they can continue to survive. So one of the properties of life being that organisms are adapted to their environment. And then finally, in this slide, the last property that we're talking about in this slide is growth and development. So living things, they grow and develop over time. So if you think back to you, maybe 5 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, or however, back in time, you look different now than you did when you were a child, when you were first born, when you were a fetus inside your mother's womb. So growth and development occurs in all living things. Okay, so over time we grow and we change over time until we reach that mature state. So living things do that. So for example, you can see the kittens, those kittens, they're still young, right? They're kittens, and just looking at them, they look really cute. And the reason why they look really cute is that their head is not quite proportional to their body. It's a little bigger than it should be. But as they mature to an adult cat, the head becomes more proportional. So you can see that they change over time. Plants, they grow and develop as well. So think of, where did a tree come from? It came from a sapling, which, grew from a little tiny seed in the ground. And so it grew and developed over time. Living things, they grow, they develop, they adapt, and they reproduce. So those are 3 characteristics of life. And then also another property of life is that living things, they regulate inside their bodies to help them maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis refers to the relatively stable internal temperature required to maintain life. So for example, if I were to take this temperature of this polar bear, I would see that it's around maybe 99 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around there. But the environment that polar bear is certainly not 99 degrees. It looks a lot colder than that. There's snow everywhere, so I'm guessing, it's probably around freezing, if not lower than that. And so how does that polar bear have such a warm temperature compared to its external environment? Well, it's maintaining homeostasis. So maintaining homeostasis means, again, that you're maintaining stable internal conditions even if the external environment is changing. So if the temperature outside changes, the temperature inside this organism will remain the same. Okay, so it will do this by regulating different processes. So for us humans, if I was to step outside into freezing temperature, my body would react, okay, because it wants to maintain a temperature of around 96 degrees, 97 degrees Fahrenheit. So what would my body do? It would start to shiver. And by shivering, it's going to be producing heat to keep my body at a constant temperature, even though it's 32 degrees outside. So we're trying to maintain that stable environment internally via homeostasis so that we can continue regulating the different processes that are required for our bodies to survive, so that I can continue with undergoing cellular respiration, that I can maintain constant pH levels in my body so that the enzymes work properly and so forth. So homeostasis, maintaining internal conditions. Another characteristic or property of life. So one more characteristic or property of life is energy processing. So energy processing is the ability to transfer or take one form of energy and convert it to a more usable form. So for example, look at this California condor. So how do California condors get their energy? Well, they eat, right? So this guy, he might be searching around for a tasty carcass to devour, and so that it can bring in chemical energy in the form of this dead meat in order to get energy so that it can fly. Well, it's not using that meat, right? Instead, The condor's digestive system is breaking down the meat into nutrients, and then the cells are absorbing the nutrients and converting that chemical energy into a usable form. In this case, it would be ATP, a form of cellular energy. So this condor is processing energy so that it can use ATP, a different form of energy, in order to fly. Okay. Plants, they process energy as well, right? So plants, being another living thing, they do it differently though. They don't eat, right? Instead, they use light energy from the sun to convert the chemicals carbon dioxide and water into sugar. So they're basically using light energy to transform molecules into chemical energy. So energy process is something that all living things do. And then finally we get to evolution. So populations of living things evolve over time. Now, if we think about it, has the Earth always been in the same state as it is now? If I were to travel back in time, say 1 million years ago, would I see the same environment that I do today? Probably not. And so because the environment is changing over time, the organisms, they also need to change over time. Now, individual organisms, we don't evolve, okay? So like you are not going to evolve, but populations of individuals can evolve over time. And that way that they can become better adapted to the changing environment. So evolution is just basically genetic changes in a population over time. Okay, so genetic changes, those are just basically some change in the genetics caused usually by some sort of spontaneous mutation. And if that genetic change provides some sort of advantage to the individual that possesses it, then that individual is going to be more likely to pass on its genes containing that change to the next generation. And if that offspring of those individuals survive in their environment better, then they're going to pass on their genes to the next generation. So over time, the population as a whole will see that advantage, that change in that population become more frequent. Okay, so over time that population is kind of evolving to be better suited for that environment. So that's what evolution is. So that is another property of life that we see. Okay, so we went through the 8 different properties or characteristics of life. So all living things have order to them. They respond to stimulus or respond to some sort of stimulus. They grow and develop. They reproduce. They adapt to their surroundings. They process energy. They regulate and maintain homeostasis. Populations evolve. So all of these are properties of life. Now we're going to take a closer look at that first property, order, and we're going to break it down a little bit more in the sense that we're going to look at the biological organization of life. So the biological organization of life just basically means that we can organize life into different levels and perhaps study those different levels. So the smallest level that we can find inside a living organism would be an atom. So an atom is the smallest unit of matter that retains the property of an element. So you might think of examples of atoms, and we'll get into some elements in the next chapter when we talk about the chemistry of life, but something like oxygen or hydrogen or carbon. So those are individual atoms, units of matter that retain the property of that particular element. Now, if we take 2 atoms and we put them together and hold them together with a chemical bond, we form a molecule. So molecules are made of atoms. Now, a macromolecule is a large molecule that's formed through taking a bunch of smaller molecules and putting them together through polymerization. And in subsequent chapters of our textbook, we're going to look at the four main categories of macromolecules in living things. So that would be carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So for example, you see here on the right, we have a picture of DNA. So DNA is a type of nucleic acid, and it is formed through a bunch of molecules. So each one of these parts of the DNA consists of something called a nucleotide. And then if I look further at that molecule, that nucleotide, I can see that it's made up of phosphorus and oxygen and carbon and hydrogen. So we can see that it's, the individual atoms that make it up. So we're going to take a closer look at the four macromolecules of life when we get into chemistry of life, which is the next chapter. Okay. And then moving even bigger, we can take those aggregates of macromolecules and surround them by membranes to form what's called an organelle. So if we look inside of a cell, we might notice different parts of that cell that carry on different functions. For example, we might see a nucleus that houses the DNA, or mitochondria that are the powerhouses of the cell that process that chemical energy and convert that energy into a usable source, ATP. So organelles are basically aggregates of macromolecules surrounded by a membrane. And we'll further talk about the different organelles of life in chapter 3 when we get into cell structure and function. Okay. So far, the different organization of biological hierarchy, those levels are not considered alive, okay, because they don't have all the properties of life that we talked about. So atoms, they don't have order to them, and the process energy and reproduce and things like that. So we can't necessarily focus in as those as being living things, even though they are found inside a living thing. So when we talk about life, the smallest fundamental unit of life that has all those properties of life is a cell. So cells that's the smallest fundamental unit of life. So they have order to them. They're made up of organelles, which are made up of macromolecules, which are made up of molecules, which are made of atoms. So cells follow that property of life. Cells also respond to stimulus. So if a cell is heated or it will change in the way to kind of move away if needed. Cells can certainly reproduce. They divide into new cells. They can grow and develop. Okay, so once a new cell is formed, it still needs to make more organelles inside so it can function properly. Cells can adapt to the environment that they are in. Cells can evolve over time. That's how we get things like a heart cell versus a liver cell and so forth. Cells can process energy. We talked about the mitochondrion. Cells can maintain homeostasis. Okay, so all of those are properties of life which cells have. So cells are the smallest unit of life. Now, if I were to take every single cell in the entire world, okay, we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of cells, I can actually just separate them into two categories. They could be classified as prokaryotes or eukaryotes. So the difference between the two has to do with the organelle stage or level of organization. Now, not all cells have a nucleus, okay? So they don't have a membrane-bound organelle. They have macromolecules that are made of molecules and made of atoms, but they don't have that simple stage of organelle. Okay, so we call those types of cells prokaryotes. Okay, so prokaryotes, an example of a prokaryote would be, for example, bacteria. So bacteria, if I look at bacteria under a microscope, I would not see a nucleus. I would see different components of the cell, such as ribosomes that make proteins and DNA, one of the macromolecules, but I wouldn't see it found inside a membrane-bound nucleus. So prokaryotes, they're single-celled or colonial organisms without a membrane-bound nucleus. Okay. So the other category of cells mean they do have a nucleus. Okay, so for example, if I took one of your cheek cells and put it under a microscope, on a slide under a microscope, I would see a nucleus, and that's where the DNA is housed inside. So cells like that have membrane-bound organelles, including nuclei, are called eukaryotes. So again, some cells don't have a nucleus, but have all the fundamental properties of life. Those are prokaryotes. Eukaryotes, they do have a nucleus and other organelles. So those would be like animals, plants, fungi, things like algae, paramecium. Those type of organisms are considered eukaryotes because they have the nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. Okay? So if I take a collection of cells and that are similar in structure and they function similarly and work together, they might be what we call a tissue. So tissues are kind of a higher level within our life's organization. So tissues being groups of similar cells carrying out similar or related functions. Now, not all organisms have tissue, okay? So this, some of these organizations are absent in all levels or all organisms. For example, if I'm a single-celled organism, I'm just one single cell, so I don't have tissue, because tissue is a group of similar cells carrying out similar or related functions. In my body, humans, we actually have 4 main categories of tissue within our body. We have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue, we have nervous tissue, and we also have muscular tissue. So those are examples of groups of cells that carry out similar functions. So epithelial tissue is a group of cells. We can also take a look, going even bigger, at organs. So organs are collections of tissues grouped together to perform some sort of common function. So if I take a look at like a heart is an organ, right? And that actually has all 4 of those types of tissue. It has epithelial tissue surrounding the heart and the chambers of the heart. It has muscular tissue that contract, push the blood in and out of the heart. It has nervous tissue that are sending the electrical impulses to stimulate the contraction of the heart. And it has connective tissue, blood being a type of connective tissue that carries oxygen through the body. So organs, they're just collections of tissue that perform a function. And then getting even bigger, we can study organ systems, which are functionally related organs working together for some sort of, purpose. So for example, my digestive system is a collection of different organs that help me process the food that I'm taking in and break it down into a usable form. Okay? And then finally, we can reach the level of an organism. So that is an individual living entity. Okay, so a human being, a squirrel, a cat, a tree. So those are all examples of organisms. But just as I said before, when we're going through the levels of biological organization, just remember that not all levels are present in every single living thing. So my bacteria friend here, single cell prokaryote, doesn't have tissue, doesn't have organs, doesn't have an organ system because it's just one cell. So the organism itself is the cell. Okay, so it's a little different. Plants, they don't have organs, right? But they're made up of cells, and they have, something that's kind of similar to tissue in a human body, but it has it's a little different category. So not all of these levels are included in every single living organism. And then even we can go beyond just a single organism. For example, we could study a population of individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. So that's considered a population level of organization. So I could be observing all the squirrels in the eastern gray squirrels that are living in my backyard right now, and studying, what they're doing. So I'd be studying the population level of biological organization. Or maybe I could see how those squirrels are interacting with the birds at the bird feeder, or are, preventing themselves from getting eaten by the coyote that's wandering around the neighborhood or something like that. So if I'm going to that level, I'm studying a community. So communities are looking at all the populations inhabiting a particular area and studying the different interactions that they're having, the predator-prey relationships, the food chain, the food web, things like that. So that's all part of a community. Or I could even look bigger and include abiotic components. So if I'm looking at all the living things within an area and how they are responding to the abiotic non-living parts, then I'm looking at the ecosystem level. Okay, so I might be looking at the chaparral ecosystem in Southern California or something like that, or I could study the boreal forest ecosystem in Canada. So in that case, I'm looking at not just the living component, but also the abiotic non-living component, because that abiotic non-living component is influencing what can inhabit that area. Okay. Or maybe I can even study everything, okay, all the living things together in a collection. So that is the biosphere, a collection of all the ecosystems representing the zones of the earth. So those are all the different levels of biological organization, and we can study each one of those levels if we want, okay? And some organisms don't have all the lower levels, just recognize that. So here's just kind of an example of the flow of biological levels of organization. So I can look at the cell, the smallest fundamental unit of life, such as our human blood cells, or maybe I want to get even more specific and look at individual organelles within that blood cell, okay? Or maybe I want to see how the cells work together to form tissues, such as our human skin tissue. Or maybe I want to see how the tissues, different tissues, work together to function in, for example, the breaking down of food particles in my stomach, an organ. Or maybe I want to see how the stomach is part of a process of breaking down my food and it's working together with other organs, such as my small intestine and my pancreas and so forth, to break down the nutrients in that food source. Or maybe I want to study the organism level, so looking at an individual, such as a squirrel in my backyard. Or maybe I want to look at the population of squirrels and see what they're doing. Or maybe I want to look at how the population of squirrels are interacting with the population of dark-eyed juncos and the Douglas fir trees and so forth, and looking at the community aspect. Or maybe I want to look at how the environment, the abiotic non-living environment, is impacting what can live there. So I can look at the climate and the precipitation levels and the topography of the area and the rocks and things like that, and how they interact or how they influence what can survive there. Or maybe I just want to study everything and look at the biosphere level, which encompasses all the ecosystems on Earth. So based on the information we've presented so far, let's see if we can answer this question. So which of the following statements is false? And this is a visual connection question, so I have over on the left, that visual aid from the textbook. So it says here, tissues exist within organs, which exist within organ systems. So is that true or false? Do tissues exist within organs, which exist in organ systems? Yeah, that seems correct, right? So tissues are found in organs, and organs are found, help make up organ systems. So this one is a true statement. So that's not false. How about this one? Communities exist within populations, which exist within ecosystems. Does a community exist within a population? Isn't it the other way around? Populations exist within communities. So this one sounds false to me. But let's see if it's the only false statement. So organelles exist within cells. So organelles do exist within cells, which exist within tissues. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, organelles exist within cells, which exist in tissues. So that one's true. How about communities exist within ecosystems, which exist within the biosphere? That one's also true. So the one that is not in the correct order, therefore is false, is that communities they don't exist within populations. Okay, populations exist within communities. So the second one is the false statement. Here's another question for you. The smallest unit of biological structure that meets the fundamental requirements of living is it the organ, the organelle, the cell, or the macromolecule? So which one has all the properties of life and is the smallest unit of that? If you answered cell, I would agree with you. Organs, they do have all the properties of life, but they're made up of cells, which are smaller than that also encompass all the properties of life. Organelles, they don't have all properties of life. Okay, so an organelle, for example, cannot adapt. Okay, it's inside a cell, so that is not something that has all of the components or characteristics or properties of life. Macromolecules, they're not considered living because, again, they don't have all the properties of life. So cell is the first the first stage of our level of organization that we can consider living. Anything above that is also considered living, but anything below that, like organelles or macromolecules or molecules or atoms, are not considered alive. Okay. And then here's another review question. This one, I took away the levels of organization, so we have to figure out if we can sequence them from the most inclusive to the least complex. So let's see which one, first of all, which one's in order, and then from there we can decide which one is going from most inclusive, encompasses most, to most specific or least complex level. So would it be, so an organelle to tissue, to biosphere, to ecosystem, to population? Well, we know that organelles are found in tissues. Tissues, yeah, they're found in the biosphere, but as the biosphere then it goes to ecosystem. So that doesn't seem like it's in order because things are a little out of order there. Plus, we're not going most inclusive to least complex. Organelles have less complexity than tissue, so it's in the opposite direction. So that one's not correct sequence. Organisms are part of organisms. That's true, yeah. Organisms are part of tissues? No. So the order is wrong there, and we're not going from most inclusive to least. Organisms are part of communities. That's true. Communities are part of the biosphere. Well, that's true. The biosphere is part of a molecule? No, the order's off there. And we're not going from most inclusive to least complex. So the last answer must be the correct one, right? Process of elimination. So biosphere encompasses ecosystems. That's true. And ecosystems are made up of communities. Well, that's true. Communities are comprised of populations. Well, yeah. And populations are groups of organisms. Yeah, so that one is the correct sequence. So we have the correct sequence, and it's going from the most inclusive to the least complex. So that's the correct answer there. Okay. So now that we have an understanding of the organization of life, we're going to look at the diversity of life. So first off, the diversity of life, we have like 1.8 million species that are existing right now on Earth that have been categorized, cataloged, and studied. There's probably anywhere from 10 to 100 million out there that we have yet to discover. So there is a huge diversity of life. Now, how did we get so many species? How do we get so many different, going from a blue whale to this little microscopic bacteria cell? So there's this diversity of life. Well, the source of diversity of life is evolution. So what is evolution? Here's the definition. Evolution is the process of gradual change during which new species arise from older species. So this idea, actually it's a scientific theory, that over time we have populations of organisms changing so that they can basically become better adapted to their environment. And as they become better adapted, they start to look different from the previous, their ancestors from a long time ago. So they've developed into new species. And so that explains the diversity of life. Now, if we look here on the right-hand side, this is a figure from your textbook that's basically showing the tree of life, also known as the phylogenetic tree of life. And this can show how we are related to each other. So how all living things are related to each other. And that relationship is due to the process of evolution. Okay, so we form new species arising from old species. Okay. Now, furthermore, we can take our big diversity of life, our 1.8 million species that have been discovered, and we can look at them and classify them in a hierarchy, which we know as the taxonomy or hierarchy of life. So we can actually group our 1.8 million species and divide them into just 3 categories, the domains of life. Okay, so all 1.8 million species we can configure in 3 categories, which we call the domains. And then from there we can look at a domain and we can group all of those species into different groups, which we call the kingdoms within the domain. So for example, for us, for here we're showing the taxonomic hierarchy for a dog. Dogs, they're part of domain Eukarya. And then within domain Eukarya, there's all sorts of other eukaryotes. Okay, we don't necessarily just have dogs, we also have paramecium, we have earthworms, we have fish, we have trees, all sorts of stuff. So it's very inclusive within that domain Eukarya. Within domain Eukarya, we also have different kingdoms. Okay, so the plant kingdom is different from the animal kingdom, which the dog belongs in the animal kingdom. So kingdom is a little bit more specific than the broad domain category. But we can even go further and take a kingdom and divide it into different phyla. Okay, so a phyla is a little bit more specific level of taxonomy within the domain. And then from there we can even get more specific and study a class. So a class is a group within the phyla. So there's different classes that can be broken down. Or maybe we can even go even further and break down the class into different orders. And then we can get even more specific by taking the orders and classifying them into different families. And then we can get even more specific by looking at the family and dividing it into a different genre or a specific genus. And then within that genus, we can divide it into specific species level. So we have this taxonomy, this hierarchy, which goes from the most inclusive to the most specific. Okay, so domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So if we use that taxonomy and apply it to the dog, we know that dogs, they are a specific species. And that species is very closely related to a wolf. Okay, so wolves, they're they basically evolved from a wolf, and we can actually consider them very to the point where they could at one time have been the same species, Canis lupus. If we look within wolves and dogs, they're very closely related to coyote. They actually share the same genus, okay, so the same level of genre, which is considered the classification Canis. So from there, we know that coyotes, wolves, and dogs are pretty closely related to foxes. So they fall under the same family, Canidae. So it's a little bit more broad than a genus because it encompasses fox. We can also, take it a step further, and we can see that, dogs, wolves, coyotes, fox, they're all carnivores, along with lions and cats and seals and bears and things like that. So they are actually part of order Carnivora. So that's broadening it even more. And dogs, wolves, coyotes, fox, lions, seals, they are all provide milk for their offspring, just like us humans and whales and bats. So we could look at the broader classification of class. So we're all in the class Mammalia. Now mammals, they provide milk for their young, but fish, they don't. Snakes, they don't. So we can broaden that to the classification of phyla, which includes the fish and the snakes and the lizards and the turtles, along with all of the mammals. So we're in phyla Chordata. And we can even include things like earthworms, jellies, crabs, other invertebrates. So that would be followed under the classification of Animalia. So that's even broader. And all animals, we are made of eukaryotic cells, so we follow under the domain Eukarya, along with plants and fungi and things like that. So you can see how our classification system, our taxonomy, we can go from the most specific individual species to the most broad, okay? The domains of life. There's those 3 domains of life, which we'll get to in a second. But before I continue with the domains of life, I do want to concentrate on the species level. So the species level is the classification of a species, by the way, in general terms, is basically a group of individuals that have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Now that definition of species has some holes in it, and we can talk about that later when we get into like evolution and diversity of life. But for the purposes of my description here, dogs, they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring with other dogs, and they can even do that with wolves. So they could be considered under the same species category. But if I take a coyote and I breed it with a dog, most likely they're not going to produce fertile offspring. So they're separate species, but they are very closely related. They can interbreed together. So they might be found under the genus category. So they're separate genre. But if we look at that species name for the wolf, Canis lupus, look at how it does include the genus. So the lupus name is actually the specific species. So when we use a scientific name in biology, it's binomial, meaning it's 2 names actually. It includes the genus and the species. And you'll also notice that the genus is always capitalized and the species name is always lowercase. So do you know what humans, our scientific name is? It's Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens, excuse me. So Homo means man, it's capitalized, and then sapiens means wise. So it's the actual species name. So we are Homo sapiens, wise men, is what it translates to in Latin. Okay. So within our species, we have in the past had other man type creatures out there that no longer are living. So there were other individuals, different populations, different species of man out there that have died off over time. So like, for example, Neanderthals. So Neanderthals, they actually interbred with us, so we think. And so, because we have Neanderthal DNA in some of us, so that Homo sapiens neanderthalis is a subspecies. We had that ability to interbreed with them. But something like Homo erectus is a different species of humans that we evolved from a long time, or we have common ancestry with, but they died out a long time ago. So that would be a different genus. So when we're talking about the species level, we include a binomial name that includes the genus as well as the specific species name. Okay. So we talked about binomial scientific names. Let's go back to the domains of life, the broadest category. We can take our 1.8 million existing species today and divide it into just 3 categories. It's either classified as bacteria, archaea, or eukarya. So what's the difference? Well, first off, remember the smallest fundamental unit of life is the cell, and we talked about how cells, they could either be prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Well, eukaryotes, and that sounds like domain eukarya, eukaryotes have a true nucleus, right? So organisms that are made of eukaryotic cells fall under the category eukarya. So our lion friend here is considered a eukaryote. The sunflower is made of eukaryotic cells. It's a plant, so it's considered part of domain eukarya. The other 2 domains have cells that don't have a membrane-bound nucleus, so they are prokaryotes. But we can divide them even further. Mainly we use the fact that where they live to be able to describe them. So bacteria is one domain of life that can live in basically anywhere on Earth for the most part. We find bacteria on our skin. We find bacteria inside of us. We find bacteria everywhere, on every surface in our homes. So bacteria are prokaryotes, such as, you can see here, this is an example of bacteria cells belonging to our domain bacteria. Archaeans are also prokaryotes, but they're known as extremophiles. So they live in very extreme environments. So we'll find archaeans in, say, the very depths of the oceans in the thermal vents under lots of pressure. Or we might, if we go to Yellowstone, for example, and look inside the hot springs, and we can see them deep inside there. So archaeans, they are very similar to bacteria in the sense that they don't have a nucleus, but they are different enough that we can't classify them as bacteria domain because of the environments that they live in. They tend to have different structures compared to bacteria. Okay. So these are the 3 domains of life. We being part of domain eukarya, along with plants and fungus and things like that. Archaeans and bacteria are prokaryotes, but they're further differentiated based on the environments that they can survive in. And then we have the branches of biological study. So just like we have the kind of the levels of organization of biology, we have different levels of biology that we can study. So sometimes people get interested in looking at the macromolecules, the carbs, the lipids, the proteins, and looking at molecular biology. So that's a branch within biology that we can study. Or maybe we can look at biochemistry, so we can look at how different chemicals make up a cell, and those chemicals get produced by the cell, and we can look at that level. So like insulin and things like that are produced by pancreatic cells. So how does that occur? So we can look at the biochemistry level. Or maybe we can study microbiology. So that's another field of biology where we look at the microscopic view of life. So this could be looking at inside of a cell, or maybe cells that are microscopic, or maybe even organisms themselves that are microscopic, such as bacteria that can make us sick. So microbiology kind of looks at the microscopic view of life. Neurobiology is another branch of biology, which looks at the tissue, the nervous system, nervous tissue. So we could study like neurons and their pathways, how that relates to communication of within the brain, of processing information and things like that. So neurobiology is a study of biology. Paleontology, like our picture here, we have you can see those researchers are excavating dinosaur fossils. So in this case, paleontology is studying fossils, so organisms that existed in the past. Zoology is an area of biology that interests me the most because it's studying animals. So it's classifying animals and studying, what is different between a lion versus a tiger or something like that. So categorizing different groups of animals. Botany is the study of plants. So that's looking at a different kingdom entirely. Instead of animals, we're studying plants. So there's all sorts of different branches of biological study. So some of them might not be interesting to you, but some of them might be more interesting to you. Myself, I prefer zoology over biochemistry, for example. So I might be, more interested in that realm of biology. And then the last part of this section of our textbook goes into scientific ethics. So one thing we need to understand with science is that scientists, we don't want to do anything that's going to cause harm or damage to humans or animals or the environment. So this is something that our scientific community hasn't always been part of in the past. You can think of a lot of things that have occurred in the realm of science in our past that's not very ethical. So for example, like the Tuskegee project that took place where scientists, they did some very inhumane experiments on African American people to study, what could, be possible medications and things like that for humans. And so that, damaged a lot of people and killed a lot of people, and we would consider that unethical today. So this idea of scientific ethics, just realize that it is evolving. So some areas of biology, for example, might test on animals because, we think of like the bigger good of it. Testing a vaccine on an animal instead of a human might, tell us whether it's going to be safe for humans or something like that. So with bioethics, it is an evolving part of science where we have to kind of strike a balance between the benefits with the harm. And, in the past, we kind of learned what we've gone too far of, and hopefully the history that is within our scientific research, we can use that history to make us, decisions of how to make sure that we're not damaging people, the environment, and animals in the future. Okay. And then as far as scientists, when we do research, we want to make sure that our research and the communication of our research is free of bias. So we don't want to include our personal bias in, we want to exclude that as much as possible when we are making, constructing experiments and presenting data and so forth. So how do we ensure that our research is free of bias and things like that? Well, we can get into the process of science, which is our next section within the Introduction of Biology, Chapter 1. So we've finished this first section, so by now you should be able to identify and describe the properties of life. You should be able to describe the levels of organization among living things. You should be able to list examples of different subdisciplines of biology. The rest of the chapter, we get into the process of science. So that will be the next video that I'm going to present. So again, you might want to click that subscribe button so that it's easier for you to find my next video. Okay, so I will move on and look at the process of science next.